Now, when you think of Colombia and cycling, the first thing that might come to mind is Egan Bernal or Nairo Quintana. And sporting success is definitely a part of the tradition of cycling here in Colombia. However, there's more and more attention to cycling as a mode of transport in cities. It's facing large challenges such as motorization, crisis of public transport, and increasing population in the cities. I'm Thomas van Laake, and I'll talk you through how cycling infrastructure has become an objective and also very contested part of municipal transport policy in Colombia. Among Colombian cities, Bogotá is the most well known for its cycling policies. The city hosts the largest open streets event in the world, which attracts over 2 million users every weekend. It has over 600 kilometers of cycling infrastructure, which has helped the city to grow to over 7% modal share for cycling. However, the city faces major challenges in terms of the gender imbalance, with only a quarter of cyclists being female. Cali, in the west of the country, is a less celebrated case of urban cycling. However, the city boasts relatively high use, though this is even more concentrated among young men from lower socioeconomic groups. However, the city has finally started to implement its ambitious 2005 network plan, thanks to activist pressure and government initiative. Much of these routes, sadly, do not meet design standards, however, and safety remains a major challenge in the city. There are also cities like Bucaramanga in the east of the country that do not have a long tradition of urban cycling. In the case of Bucaramanga, cycling was even prohibited on major avenues until very recently. However, the city has moved to implement pro-cycling policies, including a cycling strategy, the first cycling network, and a public bicycle system. So cycling is an important mode of transport in Colombian cities, but infrastructure conditions are not great all around. In contrast to this amazing cycling path on the west side of Bogotá, most parts of cycling trips are actually dangerous, uncomfortable. Urban cyclists in Colombian cities face difficult conditions. Many roads are poorly maintained. In other cases, they have to mix with heavy traffic or take main highways to get to where they need to be. There's more and more pressure on space as motorization continues, with the increasing presence of motorcycles especially concerning, and cycling deaths have gone up. One of the consequences of these conditions is the low usage rates by women, which generally account for less than a quarter of all users. So there is a need for the change in infrastructure along with a change in driver behavior. Not every cycling infrastructure project improves conditions for cyclists, however. Many routes created in Colombian cities are far too small or create conflict between pedestrians and cyclists. Other routes do not connect or give priority to cars at junctions, which means that cyclists prefer to take the right of way on the main road. However, there have been recent advances in terms of the quality of cycling infrastructure. A very important step was the creation and subsequent legal adoption of the Guide for Cycling Infrastructure for Colombian Cities. This guide includes technical criteria such as the 5 requisites for network planning based on the CRO criteria. The renewed focus on network planning is reflected in recent projects such as this one in Bogotá, which creates various connections to the wider network along a single transport corridor. Other cities, such as Bucaramanga, have been able to use this knowledge in the implementation of their first cycling networks, starting with connected infrastructure right off the bat. And there have even been attempts to implement planning at a metropolitan level, such as in this network plan by the Medellin metropolitan area. Another key area of progress is in the establishment of minimum widths for different typologies of cycling infrastructure. Whereas beforehand, cycling infrastructure would be designed to the width that the road could accommodate, there are now legal standards for the minimum and recommended widths for each type of infrastructure. Most cycling infrastructure projects involve intervening in roads that are congested or have been designed to prioritize motorized transport. And this creates many difficulties in terms of finding enough space to realize a high-quality project, in addition to limitations cities face in terms of budget and regulations. One of the ways that cities go about implementing cycling infrastructure is by placing it on the sidewalk. Now, in many cases, there is not enough space on the sidewalk to begin with, but in other cases, pedestrians and cyclists are put together in the same space, creating lots of conflicts. Sidewalk routes have another major downside in that they have to cross every intersection and entrance to a garage, and as motorized transport almost never gives priority to cyclists, many cyclists prefer to use a roadway anyways. More recently, cities have started experimenting with on-street cycling infrastructure typologies where space is taken from the motorized transport and given to the cyclists, such as in this case, where this intersection has on-street cycling lanes in each direction. Some of these projects can be very high quality, such as this project in Medellin, which created a completely new design of intersections and really changed the streetscape completely. On the other end of the spectrum, we can see temporary cycling infrastructure, which was implemented very successfully in Bogota. And many of these temporary interventions are now being turned into more long-term routes, though a complete redesign of the street is not included. One of the more recent and innovative uses of on-street cycling infrastructure is to create connections on major road bridges, where beforehand cyclists were either forced to mix with the traffic or to dismount and use a pedestrian bridge. It must be said, however, that the on-street cycling infrastructure typology does not always avoid conflict with pedestrians, especially when sidewalks are absent or very insufficient, and in those cases pedestrians are very likely to use the cycling path anyways. What would normally be a typical design for a European city, a one-directional lane on the right side of the road, is not necessarily the main design in Colombia. Many routes are located on the left, and in many cases routes are bidirectional. Some cases the segregation is plastic, and in other cases it's more permanent in concrete.
En el uso de la bicicleta en América Latina.
Nadie tiene en el mundo un día sin carro como el que tenemos nosotros en Bogotá.
Despite technical progress in recent years and increasing expansion of cycling networks around the country, results for cyclists have been mixed. Some projects are very effective at increasing cycling safety, comfort, and attracting new users, while other projects really do not improve conditions very much for cyclists, or can even make them more dangerous depending on the design of the projects. So the question becomes, after so many years of promoting cycling and constructing cycling infrastructure, why is it still so difficult to construct good, high-quality infrastructure? Some would allege that projects are affected by corruption, or perhaps even conceived in order to steal public monies. Others, however, allege that poor planning is the cause, without necessarily specifying the exact problem.
Por supuesto que todos queremos las ciclorrutas, pero estas deben ser bien diseñadas, bien ubicadas, para que no se nos convierta en otro cuello de botella de un mal superior.
Now, of course, there is some truth to allegations of poor planning, as many cycling infrastructure projects do not meet technical criteria, and some even make conditions worse for cyclists. And indeed, many cyclists complain about these projects as well, and there is political pressure to improve the projects, which has led to these regulatory advances and to better projects overall. However, most of the detractors of cycling infrastructure projects are not concerned about the needs of cyclists at all. They're more concerned about motorized vehicles. So, equivocating on-street typologies with poor planning, well, it only reveals the autocentric bias of many commentators and politicians in this country. The truth is that governments want to do good projects. There is a need for better cycling infrastructure. We have the regulations. However, there are many structural factors that limit the possibilities to really implement transformative projects on Colombian streets. As we've already touched on earlier in this video, one of the major concerns for cycling infrastructure projects is the lack of easily used space in Colombian cities. Sidewalks are narrow or non-existent in many areas of Colombian cities, and the street space is very much contested. Streets can be very congested during peak hours, and parking can also be another major barrier to cycling infrastructure projects. This use is not regulated in Colombian cities, which means that there's not a clear line between parking space and traffic space, and cycling infrastructure projects have to navigate this ambiguity. In addition, safety and attractiveness can often be opposed in the planning of cycling infrastructure. Streets that have less traffic are often less safe, especially during the night. A second major area of concern is the way that municipal governments operate. Specifically, there is a lack of long-term planning and long-term project realization that would guarantee continuous advances in terms of cycling infrastructure. Projects often have to be completed within the term limit of one administration, which is 4 years, leaving much less time for the actual execution of the project. There's also lack of coordination between different types of road projects, with cycling infrastructure being built in an isolated manner and not being coordinated with, for instance, maintenance or new road projects, leading to problems for the quality of cycling infrastructure in the long term. The social effects of these projects are also very important in terms of the opposition or support they can generate among the populace. This has consequences for the political will to carry out these projects, and has even led in some cases to the legal contestation of cycling infrastructure, which obviously adds costs and time to the execution of these interventions. One of the major barriers to creating more support among the community, especially in the long term, is the lack of effective participation mechanisms that help to explain the technical details of the projects and create a sense of co-creation and co-ownership of these projects. So Colombia is a curious case that while certain projects can create very strong opposition, especially when motorized vehicles are affected, but the idea of cycling infrastructure in general is not very contentious. Most people are for better conditions for cyclists. Most people would agree that cycling is good for cities and we would like to see more cyclists. And most people would want to use the bicycle more often and know that cycling infrastructure is necessary for that. So one of the interesting things is that detractors of projects will always say, we want to do cycling infrastructure but in a different way. However, no real alternatives are presented usually, and this is more rhetoric than an actual proposal. It still creates a question, why is cycling so uncontroversial in Colombia? Why is everyone in favor of cycling? And that really has to do a lot with the culture and the politics of cycling in Colombian cities. In Colombia, bicycles are a national symbol. Of course, the sporting heroes are one of the reasons for this, but they're also very present in the cities and the everyman's transportation mode. They're also very present during protests, for instance, such as during the recent Paro Nacional. But they're also conceived as a political objective, specifically thanks to the efforts of activists, such as the activists that launched the Ciclovia back in 1974, and more recent colectivos, which organize different types of critical mass rides and cycling events. They also organize to create political pressure and incentives to promote cycling, for instance, in the Foro Nacional de la Bicicleta, which is held every year in a different city. And this has had its effects on municipal politics, with photographs on the bicycle.
Porque somos la ciudad que ha construido más kilómetros de cicloinfraestructura, porque distribuimos las calles para darle vía a los biciusuarios, porque tenemos más de 200,000 viajes diarios en bicicleta.
So as a foreigner in Colombia, my knowledge about urban cycling, aside from my cycling trips around Bogota and other cities, comes from the work I've been doing with Despacio, a Colombian NGO. We work mostly on sustainable mobility projects in the Latin American region. You can check out some of our work at despacio.org. There's various publications, including many articles in English as well. Most of the points raised in this video actually come from the research we've been doing for an article series that is forthcoming this month. First version is in Spanish. So having grown up in the Netherlands, it's been a very different experience riding my bike around Bogota and other Colombian cities. It's a very frustrating experience in many cases, while it can also be inspiring, especially during Bogota's Sunday ciclovia. In any case, it's been a very interesting place to think about cycling infrastructure and cycling policies. And I'm planning now to further pursue this research in a PhD starting this September at the University of Manchester. So I hope to keep doing new studies and also to bring the perspective from Colombia back to Europe, the UK and other contexts to study cycling infrastructure around the world. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting or enlightening or perhaps inspiring.